I'm going to record this lecture over chapter 6 so that you can take the unit 6 quiz that's due at the end of next week, depending on when you watch this. Look at the syllabus for deadlines. Let me share my screen to the PowerPoint. Okay, so we're in chapter 6. The process of research in psychology, sampling. So we're going to talk about our samples versus populations, the different samples we use to generalize to different populations and why we choose to do it that way. So the population is the group that you want to learn about. That's the entire group, everyone with autism, all moms who are postpartum, anyone who has major depressive disorder diagnoses, right? But you as a researcher cannot go talk to all of those people, right? You can't interview everybody who has that thing. So the sample is the group that you get to participate in your study, that if you collect the right way and conduct the right way would be generalizable to the entire population that you're interested in. So sampling error is the difference that occurs between the sample that you actually did your experiment on and then the population itself. Probability samples are most likely to be representative of the population, whereas convenience samples are not chosen randomly, and so there's a little bit more room for error, although we use convenience sampling a whole lot. Simple random samples. Those are samples that are chosen randomly from a population. And that means that every individual in that population, everyone with Alzheimer's, every third grader in your area, whatever, they all had an equal chance of being selected for your sample, for your group. Cluster samples are samples that are chosen randomly, but they're from clusters of identified like groups in that population. And then stratified random samples are samples that are chosen from a population so that the proportion of the individuals with a particular characteristic is equivalent in the population and the sample. So what that just means is if whatever percentage of individuals you think out of moms who have kids, right? The percentage that end up getting diagnosed with postpartum depression for your sample, if it was a stratified random sample, say it was 3% of 5%, whatever number would be true for moms who end up with postpartum depression out of the 100% of moms that had babies that year. Your stratified random sample, you would have 5% of the people in your sample that had postpartum depression and the other 95% wouldn't be diagnosed with it. So it's just reflective of the actual real life population. Simple random samples are less likely to over or underrepresent the population. That's what we use for things like general polling. And that's difficult to obtain for larger populations. So if you're looking at every third grader in America, right? Well, it would be difficult to get a simple random sample for that. Cluster samples are easier to obtain probability for. So like if you had students at 25 different universities versus every student at every university in the country, right? It's easier to get a cluster sample. It's easier to say, well, let me go to these 25 universities and ask those students. Or if you're doing something on inmates in prison, right? Difficult to go to every prison in America and ask individuals there your questions, but you could say I chose these 10 and I went to these 10 prisons and asked these questions. It could also be used in a hierarchy, the cluster samples, so you could identify a course at a university and ask students in each one of those classes to be the sample from that cluster. So instead of talking to every student at all 25 of those universities, you could talk to every student who took history that semester at those 25 universities. So it kind of pared down your sample. But cluster samples also might not be fully representative of the population, because what if the 10 prisons that you chose are in West Texas? That doesn't mean that that's reflective of the entire prison population in the United States, right? That might not be the same as the prison population in Boston or San Diego. And so it's not always representative just because you got a cluster sample and people had an equal opportunity. Solutions could include another level of clusters, where you could stratify your random sample. That might help. So if you stratify your random sample, that ensures that the factor is represented and you control for some of your biases. Can and Schlossler did a study on student faculty mentoring, and that's mentioned in your textbook. And so they were looking at relationships in graduate programs and professional psychology specifically. And so I would encourage you to go look at your textbook and read on that study. The probability sample could be important when sampling error is likely. So if you think, hey, this is probably going to give me an error based on the area or the region or the population of the sample that I'm looking at, you need to know that your results could be influenced by the demographics, just the individuals that you have in your study, and that participants differ in behaviors, right? Individuals are different. And so there's always this individual difference variable that we can't 100% control for. But you can use convenient sampling if random sampling isn't possible. The limitations of convenient sampling is that your sampling error is increased and it's less likely to provide a good representation of the population, right? If I just announced my study at Tarleton and I just used Tarleton students, it's easier, but it's probably not representative of the entire student population of the United States. Convenient samples use volunteers, right? Individuals are recruited for the sample. Students could sign up for these studies. You get extra credit. Maybe you get a gift card. You get entered into a drawing for a free something or another, right? That's like the research that I sent out that I said you could participate in for extra credit. Or when you sign up for stuff on SONA, the psychology's research page, right? Those are volunteer samples. You're volunteering. Yeah, you get extra credit, but no one's making you do it. It's common because it's the most convenient and it doesn't reduce the generalizability a lot, right? It does, but not so much that it's always flawed. A quota sample is like a stratified random sample, but it doesn't have random selection. So its goal is to represent specific subgroups in the same proportion to the population. So it can't be random because you need it to be equal in representing specific subgroups. And it also uses convenient sampling techniques, just with specific subgroups in mind. There's also snowball samples. So when you participate in this survey or this study, right, you recommend future participants. And so you say, well, I participated in this, and they ask you to give 5 friends and their email addresses that you think might be interested in future studies. And so that's helpful if you need to find a super specialized population. So maybe you were doing a study on individuals who were deaf and some sort of like audio processing something. Well, it would be probably difficult for you to go find a lot of hearing impaired individuals, but in those communities, right, they have groups, they have ways that they know each other. And so if you're looking for a really specialized population, you could ask them, hey, can you give me the name of 5 friends, phone number, email, who also have this, and so that I can contact them for future studies, which is cool because it gets you to a population that you might not be able to find on your own or not as easily. But it also could introduce bias because now someone who already participated in your study is recommending others who could participate in your study. And so it just, maybe it doesn't have bias, but maybe it does, because maybe this individual is also only friends with individuals who would also participate. And maybe that's not reflective of the population. Or maybe they tell them something about your study. And so now these other individuals aren't coming in completely unaware of what's going on. Maybe their friend told them a little bit about it. And so for many reasons, it might introduce some bias. So when we're comparing probability and convenient sampling, we need to debate the importance of external validity, right? We always talk about external validity versus internal validity and which one's more important and what we're looking at in each study. So a lot of researchers say that when we get volunteers who just volunteer to participate in our study, that's not representative. That doesn't have high external validity because certain types of people volunteer and other types don't. They said for convenient sampling, it might be less of a problem, but we need to examine what's possible. We need to examine how we can get our sample and what the best way is to get that sample. Think about political polling, right? How many of you have even been asked to participate in a political poll? And then out of all the people that have, how many actually did, right? So they're saying that the people who volunteer for stuff aren't necessarily reflective of the entire population. So when you're choosing your sample technique, you need to think about the population you actually want to give these results to, right? What population are you trying to help or intervene for? And then you need to think about what's the goal of this research, right? Like, what am I trying to add to the research? Who am I trying to help? And once you know that, you need to make sure you understand the difference between your target goal and your accessible goal, right? The target population, that's who you're applying it to. But the accessible population is what you actually have access to ask all your questions to. You're probably never going to have access to your entire target population, and you're going to have to pick out of your accessible population. What about diversity and inclusion, right? Traditionally, in psychology's past, samples haven't been diverse, right? Typically, we're experimenting on college students at universities. That's where most research happens. That's where most PhDs have labs. That's where a lot of our research comes from. That's where funding is, grants, right? And so, can we say that college age students are reflective of the entire population when we're coming up with all of these like results and answers and ways to apply it? That's not very diverse, right? We also have a lot of studies on the bystander effect, right? I watched the Hawthorne thing in the last video. And so Gervin says that because we have a lack of diversity in a lot of our past studies, that it's preventing scientific progress because we don't have the entire population in our samples, right? Well, so how do we recruit them? How do we get participants? How do we get our sample? Well, you define them and then you have to ask them if they want to come, right? So the way you can contact individuals will certainly affect your sample size. So what's the most effective technique for the population that you're trying to get a hold of, right? If it's older adults with Alzheimer's, probable Alzheimer's, it's probably not an email, right? It's probably not a social media flyer, scan this QR code. But if it's college students with test anxiety, that's probably a QR code on a poster or sending it out to their student email. That probably is a good recruitment technique. So you have to think about the population you're trying to reach and figure out the best way to contact that population specifically. Also incentives, right? If you're just asking people to do this for the good of science, who's going to volunteer for that? I want to think that everyone will, right? In my heart, that everyone wants to participate and progress science to the next level, but they probably don't, right? But if there's an incentive, right? If there's a gift card, if there's a free something, I don't know, if there's extra credit points in your class, students will more likely participate, or individuals will more likely participate. Just think about your Whataburger receipt, right? It says, hey, there's a survey. We want to know how this Whataburger's doing. Fill it out for a chance to win a free Whataburger meal. Are you going to fill it out? Maybe, probably not. But if it says you fill out this survey, you will get a free Whataburger meal, that probably affects whether or not you're going to fill out the survey. Not all studies require incentives because the number of participants does depend on a whole bunch of factors, not just an incentive, but it does help. Power, that's what we refer to. That's the statistical power to detect results in your sample that are in the population. So the more individuals you have in your study, the more power you have, right? The higher you're in, the more power you have to actually see if this is reflective of the population and not just individual differences. You could use the internet to sample. You could post it on Facebook, social media, Instagram, different, not chat rooms. That sounds very old of me, but groups or I don't know, groups on Reddit that have specialized like topics. Other ways that you young people find groups on the internet. You also can use it, right? There's observational techniques on the internet. You can just see people's posting habits, what people are saying. So you could see information that way. If we're using the internet, there are some practical advantages, like it's pretty cheap, right? It doesn't really cost anything to send out an email to make a free Qualtrics survey. And you get the data immediately. As soon as they fill it out, you have it. So you can get really large samples that way. And then some design advantages, it reduces bias, right? You're not sitting there asking individuals questions. It's not like you could only get people in Stephenville at your university because you sent it out over the World Wide Web. And so you can get this larger geographical area covered and you can get a lot of different types of data that way. So that's it. Hopefully, if you just understand the difference between population and survey and why we choose the method that we're choosing to access or find our population in our sample, not survey, then you should do pretty well on the Unit 6 quiz. But I hope you still read the textbook and the chapter and that you're learning everything you ever wanted to know about research methods this semester.